Thank you for inviting me, and I find this material incredibly interesting, in part because it's not evident. It's not, you have to learn how to kind of read stuff, read between the lines, and that's how I've been spending the last, I guess, 15 years or so. I was interested in this issue of civil rights for a long time. My parents were involved in the South, the Deep South, Nashville, about the time when the demonstrations were beginning. Father was at Fisk University, and when a number of his students were getting arrested, then the parents would call our house. I was a little tiny kid at the time, but I remember to this day how my father increasingly spent time on the phone listening to irate parents. These parents were middle-class African Americans from the North who wanted their kids to get a good education, but also to meet somebody who was also black and from the middle class. And the last thing they wanted to read about was their kid going to jail. And so, you know, that was sort of the experience that I was around when I was a kid. And I think it was in part because they didn't tell me what this stuff meant as I was growing up, and maybe it's because I wasn't really asking questions, being self-absorbed as a young person. When I became an adult, I began to be curious about it, and I think it's one of the reasons why, probably the main reason why I've gotten interested in teaching or studying civil rights history. For me, civil rights history isn't really the history of black people per se, as much as a history of dynamics, of power, of citizenship. It of course includes the history of African Americans, but it also says a lot about the history of white people as well, and issues of class as well as race. All those things figure into it. And especially when you begin to look at civil rights for the second half of the 19th century, it becomes increasingly a study of people native born here versus immigrants. And so with that many avenues, with that number of avenues intersecting on this particular issue of civil rights, it made the study of it a very nice way for me to kind of understand what my adopted state was about. I'm from New Orleans, as I said before. I haven't said it before, but I'm from New Orleans, and I used to think that New Orleans, there was no history that was as colorful as Louisiana, because we're all chauvinists. We don't learn anything else down there, but that was one thing that we did learn. And I came here initially to go to Gustavus. I wanted to study abroad, so my folks sent me up here. And I saw at Gustavus that the notion of diversity really was having Norwegians on a Swedish campus. And I thought that was interesting, but I stayed, and I stayed because I began to learn through my classes of this very interesting history of leadership in the area of civil rights. At the time, it wasn't really studied, but I did know of Hubert Humphrey. I knew something about Hubert Humphrey. Knew something about Don Frazier, although not a lot, Orville Freeman. And it's because they were on the right side of history with Johnson in the 60s, and that's when my parents that's the topic and the names that I heard over the dinner table. So I didn't fully understand what that meant. But then as I began to settle in Minnesota, I realized that this was also a place where Roy Wilkins came to get an education. This is where he got his degree in journalism at the University of Minnesota. And he eventually would become, as you know, president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. It's also a place where Whitney Young came to get his bachelor's degree from the University of Minnesota, and he would become president of the other major civil rights organization, the Urban League. So, you know, I began to really take note of this place because I didn't see a lot of black people. And yet there seemed to be a consciousness about social justice, at least with regard to African Americans. So I began to look at it. As I did, over a course of time, I learned that this was a place back at the turn of the century where the leaders of a burgeoning civil rights movement met. People like Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells, T. Thomas Fortune, who was considered the dean of black journalism, and many other notable people met here to address a modern agenda for civil rights, and they met of all places at the state capitol. The doors were opened up for them to meet. That said something about the leaders of this state. The first black legislator to be elected got elected not from a community where there was a large black population, but just the opposite. From those sections of Minneapolis and Eden Prairie and other suburbs that comprise this legislative district, which had a fraction of an African-American presence. He was elected there. Frank Wheaton was elected, and he passed or was central in passing 2 amendments to the civil rights law that had been passed in 1883. And then it gets even deeper. Well, I'll come at that from another angle. Up until then, I'd only been interested in national civil rights history. And it was only after a long period of time, often by accident, that I realized just how deep and profound and curious and interesting and frustrating and heartbreaking a civil rights history in Minnesota was. And that, of course, compelled me to delve a little bit deeper. All in an effort to try to understand who we are. I was in law school a couple hundred years ago, it seems like, and I was trying to come up with a topic for law review, and my brother-in-law, who, like I suppose many brothers-in-law, know everything about everything, and who had a wonderful habit of coming over to the house every Sunday to eat our food and spend the afternoon there, was telling me one day about a slave trial that occurred in Minneapolis in 1860. And I thought, like everything else he said, it was sort of something that he thought he read. And it turns out that he did, in fact, read a footnote to that effect. So that opens up a whole nother window into the Minnesota experience. There was, in fact, a slave trial that occurred in Minnesota. It was due in part because of the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott had been decided in 1857, and what that did is basically tell Southern plantation owners that while this is technically and constitutionally a free state, you're free to bring your slaves up here anyway, and you need not worry about losing ownership. And the place that they wanted to go was what was then called St. Anthony, which we now know to be Minneapolis, but it's over by the Stone Arch Bridge and Procna's and in that area, which was then St. Anthony. And it was a resort spot for a number of Southerners, plantation owners. They would come to a hotel called the Winslow Hotel, and it was situated on the spot where the Winslow condominiums are presently situated. And at one time, this person, the slave owner, his name is Christmas, that's another reason why I got interested in the story, because they're great names, brought his slave up, and Mrs. Christmas sent their slave to get one of her dresses repaired, and she went to the seamstress shop just a couple doors down from the hotel, about the place where Procna Restaurant is located. And what she found when she walked in completely surprised her, because who she met was Emily Gray, a free black woman from Philadelphia who owned the shop. It was her own business. She was from, as I said, the North. And she was also well connected with a number. She was well liked by the white population, which was the only population in St. Anthony. And she apparently, seeing in Emily Gray somebody she wanted to be, said, "I want to be like you." At which point Emily says, "Let me talk to some friends." And later on, a posse forms and takes her takes the slave woman from her master, brings her to court, and the court is filled with people who are fearful at what they're seeing about to happen. Namely, these paying customers are about to find that their property can be stolen from them. So the slave woman is brought into the courthouse. The place is packed. The arguments are heard. The attorney representing the slaveholder, John Freeman, the names, who's also Attorney General from the state of Mississippi, and a native of New York, by the way, argues the case in behalf of continuing slave ownership. And he argues federal law is supreme here. This is a state, and the United States Constitution says that state law is preempted by federal law. Federal law is supreme here. And so he argues all the federal law that upholds the ownership of slavery in Minnesota. The attorney representing the slave woman, on the other hand, got up. His name is F.R.E. Cornell. And he says, yeah, all of that is true, except this is Minnesota, and in Minnesota we don't like slavery, and he sat down. The attorney representing the slaveholders' argument lasted about 30 minutes. Cornell, representing the freeing of the slave woman, lasted less than 5. The judge, Charles Vandenberg, at that point lowered his gavel and found in favor of freeing Eliza Winston, at which point there was a hue and cry. A riot broke out in the courtroom. At one point, a member of the mob comes up to Christmas and says, "Give us the word and we'll take her back for you." And he says, "Don't worry about it, I've got plenty where she comes from." This is all recorded. Sidebar, the judge, Vandenberg, is the guy who dedicated City Hall, Minneapolis, in 1900. And he was also the law partner for the attorney representing the slave woman, and they would both serve on the state Supreme Court. So I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition of politics and law. For the next several days, scratch that, for the next several months, there were riots, and houses were broken into, were destroyed, businesses were destroyed, people were harassed, and for the next several months, the people of Minneapolis, and St. Anthony walked the streets with cocked revolvers, waiting for the slightest provocation to start what essentially would be a civil war in Minnesota over the issue of slavery. And the only thing that would avert that, and did avert that, was news that the Confederates in April fired on Fort Sumter. And the paradox of all of this, and the thing that makes Minnesota history so compelling, is that Minnesota would be the first state to send volunteers to serve in the Union Army to preserve the Union and eventually fight against slavery. And that many of the first recruits would come from many of the people walking the streets waiting for the slightest provocation to shoot their neighbors. Well, I didn't plan to talk about that today because I've got other stories to share with you, and this other story that deals with suffrage and the other end of the Civil War is a story that I've been writing and researching for the past couple years actually, and I think that his tale says as much about a new Minnesota as this experience with Eliza Winston says about the old Minnesota. I'm going to tell you about a man by the name of Maurice Jernigan. It's an unusual name, Jernigan. And he's the kind of figure, like Jim Thompson, like Emily Gray, whose names were, who themselves are sort of spectral. They're ghostly in a sense. They're not really people who, if you read the traditional history books, you can see. You know, you read about their presence and you look at them and they kind of disappear in a sense. And that's really the challenge of unearthing these stories, because the canon gives scant reference at all to the presence of an African American people, And of those intersections were critical points and periods in Minnesota history. And so I have still a lot of question marks in this, but I want to tell you what I know right now. What I know is that in 1865, when the war ended, soldiers were returning to Minnesota, the Republican Party decided this was a time to push for black suffrage. What they needed to do was basically pass a bill authorizing a law that would then take the amendment before the voters of Minnesota. And the voters, all white men, would then be able to vote that November on whether to expand the franchise to black men. Not to black people, not to black women, but to black men. This is key to understanding this. Well, a lot of things had happened. As you suggested before, when the state and delegates to the Constitutional Convention were considering who gets a right to vote, the question of whether blacks should get the right to vote came before the Republicans, who were in the majority. And they decided against passing on supporting black suffrage. They wanted to wait for a safer time so that the voters could take the lead on this issue. The Republican Party in 1857 did not want to take a lead on this issue. In 1865, the Republican leadership decided the time was right. And so they put this question on the ballot, and in 1865, the voters voted against black suffrage. So what do the leaders do? In 1866, they tried again. In 1866, again, they failed to pass the amendment. It isn't until 1868 when they tried once again, and this time they married all of their political campaigns to this particular issue. These very popular Republican leaders among their constituents said, if you support me, you have got to support black suffrage. Because up till then, they kind of kept it a little bit at arm's length. This time, they put their political careers on the line, and the provision passed. What I know about this as well is that in 1865, 66, and 68, black men advocated for this quite openly. And this is what really kind of compelled my interest in this chapter that I want to share with you now. They would serve as the leadership of a new black political elite who would in turn around and lobby the legislature to pass a law that prohibited school segregation in Minnesota. 1869 in March, the state legislature, predominantly run by Republicans, passed a law that said any school district that segregated kids on the basis of their race would be denied state funds. And a month after that, the first black men to serve on a black jury were impaneled in St. Paul. Now, of course, these facts are like pebbles that you just drop in a pond, and there are centrifugal ripples that just kind of spring out. And that's where the history becomes fun. That's where it becomes fun. Maurice Jernigan, there's really little known of him. The first time he appears in the history at all, in any kind of official document, is in 1863. Where? In the city directory. How? He's a barber. Where's his shop? At the Merchant Hotel. Now, when you look at St. Paul at this time, Merchant Hotel was one of the most prestigious hotels in the city. It was the place where visitors came and stayed. It was the place where politicians resided when they were in town during session. And so anybody who had a business in the Merchant Hotel was going to do very well. You know the adage about business. You know, what's the rule? Location, location, location. It applies here. So for Maurice Jernigan, a black man, to have a barber shop in this hotel at a time when the social custom supported trimming hair, trimming beards, hanging out in a barber shop, and conducting important business, then you're talking about a man who was positioned to do very well financially. And as a black man in 1865, it meant that for him to have a place in the Merchant Hotel, he had the right clientele. These are clientele consisting of some of the financial leaders and the political leaders of the state, who had influence, of course. And they preferred to come to his barber shop. And why? And when you look at the history of barbering, the successful barbers, and that's a story unto itself, successful barbers were able to create a commodious environment where the men of the day could sit, cigars, the scent of perfume and lotions being applied, talking, sealing political deals, deciding legislation, making business deals, deciding who would get what property. All of this would be done in the barbershop. And for Jernigan to have this type of barbershop meant that he had developed connections because people knew him, liked him, and trusted him. This is 1863 when we first learn about him. The other way that I learn about him is through federal documents. That is the year of the draft. We're 2 years into the Civil War, and the novelty of combat, let's say, has long waned. It is hard attracting people to serve in the Army. And so Congress and Lincoln passed the Conscription Act in March 1863. And it basically requires citizens to sign up. And aliens, those who are committed to being naturalized, are also eligible for the draft, but they have to sign up for this. Well, Jernigan is not a citizen. He's a black man. He signs up. His name clearly appears on this record. And it's at this point that I learned where he was born and how old he was, because there was no other indication of this anywhere. He's a man from North Carolina. He's about 32 years old at the time. He's married, no children, and he lives in the Merchant Hotel. Now, one question that I ask about this, there are many questions, but one question, for example, that's compelling about the fact that his name appears on this document is, why would he do that? Black men were signing up this year in '63, and they had passed a law, two laws actually, in '62, in which black men could appear in uniform as militia members. The Militia Act and the Confiscation Act, could result in slaves and freedmen and contraband becoming employed by the Army. But in '63, black men were lining up to enlist. Well, a little bit later, but they could enlist in the Army. He had signed up to be drafted. And when you think about this, you got to ask the question, on the surface, he really wants to show something. He wants to do something. He wants to make a gesture. He wants to show his commitment, his manliness. But he's signing up for the draft as opposed to volunteering for an army. Those are two things. When you enlist, you're given the uniform, a musket, and orders. When you're waiting for the draft, you're waiting for somebody to come up to your house. And I was wondering, why does he choose the latter? Obviously, he has a business. It's a very prestigious business, very successful business, and if he's not around, he's going to lose it. But is there something else that he's doing by signing up? And it seems that he is. It seems as if this is a statement that he wants to make. when you consider how barbers were viewed in the 19th century, this whole thing about manhood, improving your manhood, makes all the sense in the world. Because in this Republican society, in this republic, this American republic, to be concerned about, hair and trimming was being considered as a non-American in a sense. It was an aristocrat. And of course, the paradox to that, because American history is filled with paradoxes, is that you do have an aristocracy that valued this. But on the frontier, you're supposed to cut your own hair. So the barbershop becomes a very, very private place indeed. Even Frederick Douglass, Martin Delany, another leader of the abolition movement, African-American leader of the abolition movement, who incidentally has a medical degree from Harvard and also served in the Union, in the cavalry, one of the few African-Americans who early served in the cavalry, talk about how unmanly it is to be a barber. And yet, this is the only way that black men could acquire property and status and contacts. So while they were absorbed in a profession that denigrated the person who was doing the job, looked down on barbers, this is the only way in which they could acquire all the outer vestiges of success. And there are stories of black barbers who were very successful. In order to be successful, you have to have contact, and sometimes that meant that African Americans would be living not just in white communities, but communities populated by the aristocracy of the community. And sometimes they would be leaders of the civil rights movement if the black population was very large. But in St. Paul, the black population was very small. And up until the outbreak of Civil War, it was a population that could at any time be taken away. Slave catchers were walking the streets of St. Paul, working for slave masters or for themselves. And there were a lot of people in St. Paul who were more than willing to point the finger at a troublesome black man. And so what we have here with Jernigan is a man of an uncertain past. You can't walk through the snows of Minnesota and not leave tracks. If you do so, you're doing so intentionally, it seems to me. And if you're doing so intentionally and you're a black man, chances are you're trying to evade capture. So I have a theory, and it's just a theory, that he was a runaway slave with skills and charm, and therefore all the tools needed to receive the protection of powerful men. And there are stories like that in Minnesota history in the 1850s. How else could Jernigan be positioned, come out of the mist, in effect, to get as his first place of employment, of vocation, of profession, a setting in the most prestigious hotel in St. Paul? How else could he have gotten those contacts? How else could the owner of the hotel have enough faith in this person, be assured by this individual that he's all right, if he didn't know him, or if somebody he knew him? In any event, those are reasons why, and indeed everything that Jernigan had done prior to 63 leads one to conclude that he knew how to live undercover. He knew how to be discreet. And to be a successful barber, you had to be discreet. You had to be able to charm and flatter. And you also had to be able to be quiet. Jernigan mastered these skills until 1865. Sometime between 63 and 65, he and other black barbers, they weren't as successful as he was, got together and created something called the Gold Key Literary Society. This leads me into another interesting corner of this history. Douglass talks about literary societies. These were not just places where people learned to read. These weren't book clubs. They were, in a sense, a place where books would be consumed, but they would be consumed for a very specific reason. This would be a way, reading these books was a way to learn how to make an argument. What they studied were the arguments of those who supported slavery so that they knew how to combat it. What they learned was how to make language as powerful as possible. And they practiced this in little tiny rooms, lights dim, no one knowing what they were doing. Their patrons, who may have been aware of black men coming together and reading the best literature of the 19th century and the 18th century and the 17th century. This was an indication of civilization and industry. This is proof positive that black men deserve equality, political equality. But they didn't understand the full picture because these black men were not waiting for white men to do their work for them. They were going to make their own case. Power was in the ability to speak your own truth in your own terms. And so you see in 65, the first presentation by these black men. They write an editorial in St. Paul Press talking about why black suffrage was important. Bear in mind that St. Paul was a Democratic city. Even though the Republicans controlled the state, the Democrats controlled St. Paul. And what was a Democrat in 1865? Well, he was a person who didn't necessarily support secession, but he sure as hell didn't support black equality. He was an apologist for the South, and he took no pains. He missed no opportunity to disparage the black Republicans, which was the Republican who supported black equality and black emancipation. He took all opportunities to put down that effort. He referred to the president as Lincoln, oftentimes. Massa Lincoln. I don't exactly know why that, but, and he would speak in that vernacular, he meaning the journalists of the times, the editors of the Democratic writers of the time, and the opinion makers. And they had a lot of influence because as a Democratic city, we're talking about most people in St. Paul were Democrats. Now, I don't mean the Democrats of today, the DFL. I mean a very conservative strain. St. Paul by this time was increasingly a town of labor and class tensions. And many of these laborers saw the African American. In fact, virtually all of them saw the African American as a threat. Now, it's one thing to speak in favor of suffrage when the legislature's in session, when all of your Republican friends are here. But at the end of the session, they left town. And Jernigan was still in St. Paul. This was a town in which attacks on blacks were commonplace. This was a town where being a problem could result in you being kidnapped and sent to the South, as what happened a week before the Eliza Winston case that I referred to. And yet Jernigan spoke up. He signed his name to the document, and he let people know where he was. And he did it before history caught up with him. I'm going to end with this last chapter about Jernigan, and then maybe we could have some conversation. Jernigan goes back to the barbershop. He never left the barbershop. He stays in the barbershop. He eventually moves his business to the International Hotel, which is by 1870, 71, 72, even more prestigious. And he has this palatial estate. In 73, he leaves, and his career begins to descend. And the question is, why does he walk away from the prestige? Because now, by 1872, 73, they're all on the right side of history. Even the Democrats who control the city of St. Paul recognize that we have to reconsider how to appeal to these people. We've lost the battle. They're the ones who appointed black men to the jury, not the Republicans. The Democrats did. So why did Jernigan leave? In 1873, Frederick Douglass is touring the North. He comes to St. Paul. This will be his third trip to St. Paul. It's interesting that St. Paul is a place where these leading black speakers will come. Booker T. Washington, Du Bois. I mean, we were on a circuit here. You know? Frederick Douglass gives a speech about the state of black America. 1873. And inside the opera house where he's speaking, the place is just erupting. They're just eating up everything he's saying. They love everything he has to say. While at the same time, out in the streets, a mob has formed. And this is another example of the class tension. Working class people of the street out there, screaming all sorts of epithets about Frederick Douglass. And you can hear the screaming, the catcalls inside, at which point he becomes more boisterous, more animated, and the audience inside is beginning to become even more as an attempt to drown out the screaming from outside. And when he's finished speaking, one of the hosts of the evening, the owner of the International Hotel where Jernigan has a barbershop, his name is Gilbert Dutcher, and an abolitionist, and a Lincoln Republican, obviously, came up to Frederick Douglass, a friend, and said, listen, man, I want you, he didn't say man, but I'm just kind of, he says, listen, man, I want you to stay at my place. I know you got to catch a train in the morning, we'll fetch you, we'll give you dinner, we'll party, the whole thing. And Frederick Douglass says, fine. Or in the vernacular of the day, cool. And so he goes over to the hotel. At the end of the evening, he goes to the hotel, at which point he's denied a room because of his color. So then he's out on the street. Apparently his friend hadn't told the employees, because this is a hotel, even though it's owned by a Republican, a Lincoln Republican, a former abolitionist, and friend of Frederick Douglass, this is a hotel that embraced discrimination as its policy. Blacks could not come in. So he goes to the Merchant Hotel, where Jernigan had his first barbershop, and he's denied a space there. Incidentally, sidebar, the owner of the Merchant Hotel is Charles Gilfillan, state senator, one of the founders of the Republican Party, owns all kinds of important buildings in St. Paul. He's a banker and a lawyer. His brother is one of the first justices on the state Supreme Court. And he becomes an author, sponsor of the public accommodations bill that outlaws discrimination. He's the guy who owns the hotel that won't let Douglass in. So Douglass has no place to stay. This is February 1873. You have a sense of what Douglass is feeling at age 50-something. He finally gets a room, but the policy remains discriminatory. It's about this time when Jernigan disappears. He leaves. He closes his shop. Theory. Just a theory. I think Jernigan had issues. I think he thinks that the owner was, hypocritical. And I think he saw in a lot of the Republican leadership a trend towards being complacent to what they have achieved for African Americans, and complacence to what is happening in the South as white supremacy is beginning to intensify. So Jernigan is dealing with some issues, I suspect, and trying to understand what he's feeling and seeing, I think, is really the work of historians, and I hope at some point somebody else will join me in this research. With that, I'll stop. Entertain any questions or comments that you may have. Yes?
Jernigan had some partners.
Thank you.
Jernigan had some partners. In your book, you point that out.
Jernigan was, well, this was the group that he worked with. Yes, these were other barbers.
When he goes to the International, he has a partner.
Yes, Stockton, right.
Were those partners white or black?
They were black. Actually, well, they're all black barbers. Stockton in particular is very interesting in the sense that he stays at the Merchant Hotel while Jernigan splits off to the International. You can read about his Stockton's barbershop in the St. Paul Press, which describes it as the Marble Palace. It's just below street level, which means, and it's all marble, which means that it's cool, and it's below the dust, and that all of the fixtures are either gold or silver, fine paintings. People would come to St. Paul, and this would be one of the sites where they would go. And the press reported a description of this barber shop in 3 different editions. Major thing. But they would split up.
Now you're from New Orleans.
Yes.
Okay, there's a new book out. It's got to do with 1876. And it's when the whites down in New Orleans basically went out the street and killed blacks.
Mm-hmm.
And that started segregation in the South. Because the Union with Rutherford
Behaves. Yeah, he ends Reconstruction.
And then what happened, they was found killed these blacks and they got away with it.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the beginning of where the blacks would lose any kind of political influence in the South.
Yeah.
And I wish I'd have brought the name of the book with me, but I didn't. But it's a new book. I don't know if you're from there, if you knew anything about how the blacks.
Oh yeah, I was
1876 when this happened.
I was actually reading about this very thing today. I'm working on this is the second manuscript where I'm interested in looking at these patrons. You mentioned it earlier. One of the patrons is a military officer who served in the colored infantry. And he's from LeSueur County. And he's dispatched. He becomes a member of the colored infantry, which is posted in southern Louisiana. And at this particular time, in 1866, he first talks about a race riot that occurs in New Orleans, where there's an effort to try to reverse the state constitution that banned black votes and civil rights. The Republicans restructured the Constitution, but there were mobs in the streets. And the police chief at that time, and I believe it was at this time, was James Longstreet, who was the Confederate general under Lee. He would become police chief of New Orleans. So I mean, you're right to point out that my town had some very unsettling moments in the wake of the Civil War. And there was a lot of bloodshed, and it was periodical as well. And it was one of the things that contributed to the end of.
Longstreet, by the way, was the brother-in-law of U.S. Grant, and after the war was broke, Grant gave him the job as the charge of all the goods coming into New Orleans.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
wow.
And of course, there's a little rape off there.
Yeah. Oh, that's the American way at this time.
Politics in Louisiana, is there?
No. My father, who was one of the only ones, talks about a campaign in which the Attorney General for the state of Louisiana, Jimmy Gremillon, well, his last name was Gremillon, I can't remember his first name, who campaigned for re-election to be Attorney General for the state from Angola State Prison. And he won. Yeah. I mean, that's a sign of character, I suppose, and reason enough to be elected. Brian.
Minnesota has black citizens from the 1850s on.
Mm-hmm. Residents.
Residents. Okay, that's my question.
And actually, earlier than that.
Sure. I know, I guess in the 1850 census, there are black people show up their barbers.
Right.
So they are not, from 1850 until the 14th Amendment in 1868, they don't have any, even in Minnesota, they don't have any voting rights or any citizenship rights at all. Is that right?
Well, First of all, we know of at least one black man who lived here in the 1700s. His name was Jean Bonga, and he lived up in the Duluth. Jim Thompson was a slave who was brought to Fort Snelling sometime in the late 1820s. And there were a number of slaves who resided at Fort Snelling during that period. They were owned by Lawrence Tolliver, who was the Indian agent. And there was federal policy that encouraged officers to bring slaves to this. And Dred Scott was here, resided here, and it's the basis of his residence here in Minnesota when he filed a suit saying that he was free. But to answer the other part of your question with regard to suffrage, black suffrage only applied in state law. And it was passed in '68, but 2 years before the 15th Amendment was passed. In '68, the African American is technically a citizen of the country, but doesn't have constitutional protections, U.S. or federal constitutional protections for his suffrage rights. But Minnesota had granted it to him by that time, 2 years before the passage of the 15th Amendment. But yeah, I mean, blacks didn't vote. Now, the other part of this too, Brian, is that I was going to talk about Jim Thompson, but I'm always talking about Jim Thompson, and I'm trying to break away from that habit. You know, it's hard. But Jim Thompson lived in St. Paul. He was the first black man to live in St. Paul. He was an equal among equals. His neighbors were people like Sibley and Larpenteur and Robert. You go down the streets, you see names. Those guys that lived, and they were his neighbors in St. Paul. His next door neighbor was a guy by the name of Benjamin Brunson, whose father, Alfred Brunson, was a Methodist missionary who had purchased Jim Thompson and freed him back in the 1830s. Benjamin Brunson is in the state legislature, the first territorial legislature, the territorial legislature in 1849. And in September, he's going to the Central House where the legislature met with a bill that would determine who would get the right to vote in this territorial constitution. And it specifically excludes Jim Thompson by means of his race. Only white men of 21 can vote, can be citizens. And what's interesting about this is that Jim Thompson is his next door neighbor and had known him most of his life. They were buddies. And so I've often asked classes, well, what does Jim think? What do you think Jim thinks about being denied a vote by his buddy? I mean, Benjamin walks out the house with the bill. He says, hey, what about the Vikings? Did you see Adrian Peterson? While he's about to author this bill that denies his neighbor the right to vote. And the theory that we all have is that given that the street was really a dirt path and that there was more woods around here and that you could go out and provide for yourself, that the vote didn't really matter until the place started getting crowded. At which point you couldn't actually have contact with those who made decisions. You needed people to represent your interests, and they would represent your interests if there were a lot of people like you who could leverage vote. So Jim Thompson didn't have the right to vote, and at one time it didn't matter. Jim Thompson is in St. Paul in '65 at the time that Jernigan is calling for black suffrage. And the question then becomes, do they know each other? Do they agree with each other? Do they support each other? And I have no reason to believe that Jim Thompson was on the same wavelength with Jernigan, because they were very different people. Jim comes from an old Minnesota, the Minnesota of moccasins, the Minnesota of the Native Americans, the Minnesota away from slavery, away from racism, where he could become a person by the nature of his character. Jernigan, on the other hand, North Carolina, slavery, the Fugitive Act, all of these things. And so they're just different kinds of people. Thompson's a man of the forest. Jernigan is a man of the city and a barber. I think that suffrage was a different world for him, and that Jernigan was a different world for him. So I like to think of the black population, even the few that were here, as a very diverse group, very complicated group. relationships. Yes?
Your stories are fascinating. What happened in '73 when Jernigan left? Have you been able to trace as to where he went and what happened?
Well, in fact, he does stay in St. Paul for for the remainder of the decade. His shop is upstairs in a boarding house, which is a far leap from where he began. And by 1880, I picked up on him in Cincinnati. And he was listed as a barber in Cincinnati. He was estimated, I guess he was probably in his 60s by that time. But there was no indication that he was living the life that he had lived. It just strikes me that for him to not keep his mouth shut in the face of what it meant that even a great black man like Frederick Douglass could be denied a room, denied by friends who were reluctant to change policy at the time, may have been something that he was not prepared or willing to address. He had kind of given it all during those few years when he came out. I think that once you become exposed, given how vulnerable one is, you can't really go back to the shadows. And as a way of trying to get a sense of what's going on with Jernigan, I looked at the Souls of Black Folks, where Du Bois really talks about, to survive in this world, you have to have a double consciousness. You got to have a presentation to the larger world, and you got to keep a little piece for yourself. And you're constantly battling these warring halves. And looking at Jernigan through that prism, I kind of see him as a guy who, had to tell people who fed him well, what they needed to do, and he was walking a tightrope. And at a certain time, you get tired of doing that. So I do have reason to believe that he lost his fortune, that he was a journeyman barber, that he didn't have a rich clientele, and he didn't do anything politically after that. Yes?
So this last summer I happened to be at the Chicago Historical Society doing some research that kind of had a bit to do with the fur trade, including, for instance,
Jean Boga?
Sable,
Oh, okay.
who the founder of Chicago,
Mhm.
the free black man who was a fur trader in Chicago before Chicago was known as Chicago. But in any case, part of this had to do with Lawrence Taliaferro.
Mm-hmm.
And I stumbled upon the fact that Booker T. Washington's middle name
Mm-hmm. It's
was
Taliaferro.
Taliaferro.
Right.
And I thought, Taliaferro from Virginia,
Mhm.
Taliaferro at Fort Snelling. Taliaferro, in fact, with Harriet Robinson, who married Dred Scott.
That's right.
And-
Tolliver is also from Virginia.
Yeah, and the point, and it's such an unusual name. I mean, it doesn't spell like you pronounce it.
Taliaferro,
And it
yeah.
makes me think that it's got to be looked at more. But it was like when I grew up, it was Booker T. Washington and the MGs. That's all I know.
Booker T and the MGs.
Yeah. As I became a little more educated, I began to know about Booker T. Washington and
Yeah.
historical.
Yeah.
But now here is this name Talbert. It makes me wonder.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder about the background of Booker T. Washington. And I read a little bit about his biography, and it doesn't exclude that possibility.
Right. Right.
But anyway, I just thought that was.
I think that's a very legitimate point to make because, I thought the same thing, to be honest with you. And you're right to say that the Booker T. Washington is from Virginia initially. I don't know from what part, and I don't know what part of Virginia the Tollivers were from, but it does make sense that they may have had some connection, that Washington had family roots with that plantation and that group. Yes?
Here's just a little, another thing to dig deeper into is Christmas, the slave owner.
Yeah. Oh, is he the same?
Well, I'm just saying, anybody that knows the history of Minneapolis
Yeah.
well enough knows that Minneapolis was by Charles Wheeler Christmas for John H. Stevens. And that was-
Yeah, I don't think they were related, though. I wondered the same thing, because that is a curious name. It is.
Possibly not, but what a coincidence.
It is, yeah.
Strangest, most unusual last name.
It is. It is, yeah. Yes. I'm sorry.
Do you think that the reason why Jernigan, instead of going to enlist, signed his name to be drafted was because instead of just going to the front lines, in a sense, he wants to be chosen by the United States because of who he was?
So the act of being chosen?
Right, because instead of enlisting and just, like you said, grabbing his things and taking orders,
Yeah.
to get drafted, they have to see your name, see your situation, and then call you to come.
Oh, I
I
think,
think that's why he did that.
yeah, I think that's possible, too. I mean, I don't know why he signed up. All I have are theories. And I think that makes sense. I think he's also trying to tell people, look, you know, I'm a man who's willing to fight for this nation and for my freedom, because by 1863, Lincoln has said that, you know, in the rebellious states, slavery's over. So I think it makes sense. It is a gesture that he's making, that, you know, look, the country's come to me needing me. You know, I'll do my job as a good Republican, taking care of my business and my customers and my family, and being industrious and being worthy of citizenship and equality and respect. And when my number is called, I'll serve gladly. That makes sense. That makes sense. You had your name. I'm sorry for pointing too. I apologize. The man behind you.
Where were those two hotels located?
I want to say one was 4th in Jackson, but I can tell you, if you got a copy of Larry Millett's Lost St. Paul, there's a section on old hotels that have pictures, that has pictures of both hotels. I think there's an interior of the Merchant Hotel as well, which is quite palatial. Now, I got to tell you, when you look at the facade, the hotels don't look as impressive. I know that they were viewed as prestigious because the people of the day referred to them as prestigious. But when you look at the interior, you know, and the few pictures that I've seen of the interior, you do get a sense that, yeah, they put a lot of money into this. They wanted this to be a showplace. But to answer your question, you can see pictures of them and the addresses. You can get them from Larry Millett's book, Lost St. Paul, I believe is the name of it. And that's how I was able to see what these places look like. I'm sorry, sir. Did you?
Well, I was just going to point out, at the end of the Civil War, there were 180,000 blacks under arms.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that was larger than the Confederate Army.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, like, if you have the belt and the uniform of the Union, how are you going to tear that off a man and tell him he can't vote?
Right. That's right. That's right. And that became a very powerful argument.
In fact, that guy's had 2 sons in that service, and that's, of course, Douglass.
And compounding that point, you had vets back then saying virtually the same thing. A lot of black soldiers died along the Mississippi River Valley, and some of the white officers who came back had views of the day which were about race. They had some of the arrogance and some racial bias, but for them it was an issue of justice. Black troops saved their lives and in some engagements, and especially at the port, I want to say Port Hudson, which was just north of it was really the southern. It was the southern point of the Mississippi River that the Union needed to conquer, along with Vicksburg. And it was the black unit that stormed Fort Hudson, and they were decimated. And they weren't prepared or trained or really expected to attack. But their officers said, let's attack because the Union can't break through, and they did. And the sacrifice that they gave made all the major northern newspapers, starting with the New York Times, singing singing about the bravery of black troops. And this is the first time that people thought that blacks could serve.
Who was the first unit into Richmond, Union Regiment into Richmond?
Yeah.
Was black.
It was a tribute to the black service, yeah. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, did I see a hand back there? No. Okay, yeah.
A question, you had said that in 57, the Republicans decided not to fight
Right.
the issue of black suffrage.
Yeah.
Um,
Amos Cogswell was Speaker of the House,
How did
and
that,
he was,
the topic or the issue play into the contention between Republicans and Democrats at the state constitutional convention?
Yeah.
Where they ultimately ended up with two different constitutions that, the same
Right,
constitution,
right.
but Republicans would only sign one copy and Democrats would only sign another copy?
yeah.
Was that issue part of that contention?
It was one of the issues. It was one of the issues, and I really, I'm not as sure that it was as central as some historians who have written about the state constitutional conventions would have it seem. I can understand the argument they made, and I remember there was a point in there where Sibley himself says, well, this is not even an issue. I mean, Dred Scott's already decided this issue, which said that, blacks can never be a citizen in the state. There were other issues along lines of suffrage that were compelling. One was Indian suffrage. There was, in 1851, the territorial legislature extended the right to vote to civilized Indians and Métis, or mixed bloods, or half-breeds, I forget the term that they used. But in 1857, the line was pushed a little bit further away. While newly arrived immigrants did not have to know how to speak English, Indians had to speak English. And of course, you probably are familiar with the Hazelwood Republic, which was an experiment of civilizing Indians. And it was a place where Dakota were learning to farm, and it was a small settlement, but they farmed and they became Christians, and they cut their hair and they wore pants. And they were harassed by their brethren, but they hung firm to being, part of the future. And they became literate, and they read the Bible, and they read the Constitution, and it all had been transcribed into Dakota. And so there were about 7, I believe, men who applied for suffrage, and only one was given the right to vote because he spoke English. Now, their neighbors, their German neighbors, who did not speak English, this is around the New Ulm area, didn't speak English, but they were all given the right to vote. So, I mean, there was this patchwork of suffrage. And I'm just saying that the issue of black suffrage was just one of many. And for black suffrage to be volatile, it had to mean that the Republicans were of one voice. And this is the lesson of that moment. The Republicans were not. The abolitionists were considered radicals. And many of the Republicans did not like abolitionists. So, they were willing to compromise on black suffrage. It was a different party from the one that we would see after the Civil War. Thank you so much. This is a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.